Hello viewers, thank you for joining me. This one is my yearly go at a fairly straightforward romance. I try to keep giving the genres I don't typically enjoy a chance. There have been some pleasant surprises in the past. In the case of Waiting for Spring, I already had the first 2 or 3 volumes in my possession. Upon rereading the summary on the back, I wasn't quite sure what had originally compelled me to buy them. The story sounded like the most basic of cliché wish fulfillment, but I decided to follow through and collect the rest, and for the most part, I'm glad I did. Waiting for Spring is the story of Mitsuki Haruno, a shy girl going into her first year of high school. Like many kids starting at a new school, she wants to reinvent herself a bit. She had some trouble with bullying in the past and was never able to stand up for herself. Going forward, she wants to be a little more outgoing and make some real friends, but she hasn't had much luck at the time the story starts. Until one day, when the 4 most popular boys in her school, and stars of the school's basketball team, show up at the cafe where she works, which ultimately leads to the group of friends she was looking for, and a love triangle when a childhood friend moves back to town. This is what I meant. On the surface, I feel like this idea sounds horribly cliché and contrived. Like, of course, the 4 most handsome, sought-after guys in the school are inexplicably drawn to this one shy, awkward girl who's never stood out much. There's gotta be a dozen harem series with that exact plot, where the boys' personalities are all specific tropes and the girl at the center of it all barely has a personality to speak of, or vice versa. But in practice, at least in this series, it actually really worked. For one, Mitsuki's not the only one who's a little awkward. The whole situation comes about when one of the boys, Ryuji, wants to confess his love to Mitsuki's older co-worker, Nana, the boss's daughter, except he let one of his friends set up the meeting, and Rui picked out the wrong girl, thinking it was Mitsuki he was talking about. Any charm he was going for flies out the window as soon as he sees it's the wrong girl. Watching them bicker amongst themselves, unintentionally insulting Mitsuki, who's still standing there with every comment, it wasn't just funny, they felt real. They could have been any group of teenage boys I've ever known. They certainly weren't the suave, serious princes all the other girls at her school seemed to think they were. And that's an assumption Mitsuki had to correct too. The boys start hanging out at the cafe regularly after Nana rejects him. She tells one of the other boys early on that Nana would never be interested in someone as shallow and self-centered as the 4 of them, but she soon learns that's not an accurate assessment. Towa responds that the basketball team isn't actually allowed to date, and the 4 of them are serious enough about it that they'd always plan to follow this rule, focus on the sport and the team as their first priority. But their friendship runs pretty deep too. They met all the way back in elementary school when they were in youth basketball together. This is the first crush Ryuji's ever been serious about, and they want to support him, even if they are usually making fun of him in equal measure. The friendship aspect of this story was really sweet, and just as important as the romance, I'd say. I realize I've kind of jumped around with the setup, name-dropping a bunch of characters without explaining who they even are, so let's talk about the characters. I really liked Mitsuki as a main protagonist. Her awkward moments were relatable, and her drive to better herself was moving. She tended to stumble into projects, like volunteering for the school festival committee because no one else wanted the job, and ends up earning her classmates' respect when they see how hard she works to make everything perfect, striving for the beautiful class memories she didn't get to have in middle school. I said the boys were drawn to her, but not in the sense that they all fell in love with her. Their first meeting was a crash course in how they really are just ordinary boys. Even their basketball skill comes from years of hard work. They've been put up on such a pedestal at school. They enjoy spending time with her, 1, because she's fun to tease, but also because she treats them like she would anyone else. First is Ryuji, who I'd describe as the passionate one. He's awkward and surprisingly innocent, but he really throws his all into everything he does. He was a character I found myself wanting to root for, so that, though I'd never really pictured him as a leader, I was proud when it was announced he'd be the next team captain. And while at first the idea of anything happening between Nana and Ryuji sounds ridiculous, I ended up hoping he'd get that happy ending as well. Kioski is the one you'd probably peg as the group's leader if you had to pick one. He comes the closest to the image their classmates have of them. He always seems a little more mature than the others, but he likes a good joke as much as any of them, and his teasing tends to take on a perverted edge, which actually helped to soften out how sophisticated he tried to seem. It was a longer process, but Kioski grew on me too. Rui is the sweet one, easily the most laid back of the four, and I'd say the most easily likable too. Rui was just fun to have around, and I wish I had more to say about him. It's actually kind of a running gag in the bonus comics at the end of each volume that his character wishes he had more screen time. I also would have liked a little subplot or something that explored Rui. He is one of the ones who develops feelings for Mitsuki, but his crush never seems to be taken that seriously. I kinda feel like he drew the short straw just for being the wrong love interest. Which finally brings us to the one I considered the real love interest. Towa was the only one she was already sort of familiar with, as they're in the same class, though he tends to sleep through most of their lessons. I really enjoyed watching these two grow closer. Mitsuki and Towa just fit in a lot of ways, and it's kind of unfortunate, but the best way this series had to show how good they were for each other was to introduce a rival love interest who really wasn't a good match for her. When Mitsuki was a kid, she did have one friend, Aya, who was confident and reassuring, and also into basketball, as it happens. Aya would always comfort her after a rough day at school. Mitsuki's the oldest of 3 kids, so her parents were very busy. It's not that they were cold in any way, but Mitsuki was always hyper-aware of making things harder for them, so she never told them about the trouble she was having at school. Aya was the only one she felt she could open up to, and after Aya's family moved overseas, Mitsuki took to channeling the memory of her friend to try and empower herself to become the more confident, outgoing person she wanted to be. They fell out of touch shortly after the move, but a familiar face shows up to the school's first game of the season, and Mitsuki's shocked to recognize Aya, who wasn't an older girl like she'd always assumed, but a boy who's been nursing a crush on her all this time, and of course he's now the star of another school's basketball team, so he's a rival in every way. I try to give every character a fair chance, but Aya really never grew on me. I believe he genuinely cares about her, but he's manipulative about how he tries to get close to her, and he doesn't understand what would make her happy. Aya's view of Mitsuki is frozen in time, back to when she needed him to protect her from everything. But Mitsuki's grown a lot since then, and she hates being a burden on others. She's better suited to someone like Towa, who's equally naive in a lot of ways, but who's never seen her as weak. It allows them to grow together and take any sort of relationship at their own pace. Aya likes to mock Towa for seeming childish when it comes to romance, but Mitsuki's always moved by his little gestures, while Aya's more dramatic ones tend to overwhelm her, not to mention that he's possessive and pushy past a point I can forgive, and it leaves a sour taste in my mouth that one of the main reasons Mitsuki puts up with it for so long is because she felt indebted to him for supporting her so much when they were kids, which is never what you want the basis of a romance to be, that one feels like they owe the other. Waiting for Spring is 14 volumes long, and by the time it feels like Aya's finally starting to get it, it was just too little too late for me. Just once I'd like a drama-free romance that's just sweet from start to finish. Is that so much to ask? Because that's what Waiting for Spring could have been without the love triangle. I got caught up in my least favorite part of it for a while, but I enjoyed this series in general. A lot of people aren't as put off by love triangles as I am, so I'd recommend it if you're a fan of romance, and I felt the friendship element was where Waiting for Spring really shined. I was reflecting recently on how sometimes there's a noticeable difference in the artwork at the start and end of a manga series. In both Fruits Basket and Ghost Hunt, for example, you'd almost never guess the first volume and the final volume were drawn by the same person, and that sort of growth can be really cool to see, but I also appreciate something like Waiting for Spring, where the quality was more consistent. This series looked really good all the way through, and while it's worth noting that this isn't a proper sports story, the tournaments are really quick, and the strategy meetings are practically non-existent, it's very much a romance first with a sports touch. I think that is also somewhere the artwork shined. There were some really nice panels during the games. The characters are an aspect I'm a little more torn on, and I think that's because it's the most important aspect of a story for me. The characters will make or break your tale, and don't get me wrong, they were likable enough, but in the long run, I'm not sure how memorable they'll be. Pretty often throughout the series, I found myself wishing they'd get explored in a little more depth. Mitsuki, Aya, and Towa are handled well. It's pretty late into the story, but I really enjoyed getting to learn Towa's backstory. He's being raised by his grandparents, and like Mitsuki, has always been hyper-aware of not wanting to be any more of a burden on them, which is part of why he's so reserved and quiet. Even Nana gets a little extra time spent looking into her future goals and motivations and what made her who she is today. The other three boys are presented like they're just as important, but they're not really treated that way. There are quite a few scenes of the boys hanging out without Mitsuki, and it really struck me after a while how they didn't really have anything to talk about except Mitsuki and her budding romance with Towa. Occasionally those conversations would include basketball or Ryuji's love story as well, but every once in a while it would have been nice if they'd had something else going on in their lives, something that fleshed out their characters a little more. I do have to say, Waiting for Spring is 14 volumes long, but the main story wraps up in volume 13. The last one is a collection of bonus chapters. I didn't find that out until I was reading the little author's note panels in 12 or 13, but I'd already collected the whole series by that point. Might as well read 14 as long as I had it, right? And now I'd recommend sticking it out through the end, because the very first chapter explores Kioski in a little more depth, something I'd been asking for from the beginning. So I can't say it's not worthwhile, even if I do wish they'd found time for it somewhere along the way, rather than just tacking it on at the end. Waiting for Spring was cute, even moving in some places. I'm generally a fan of characters who are constantly striving to better themselves, and if I enjoyed it, I'd imagine readers who are bigger fans of romance will probably have a really good time with this one. Thank you for watching.